So, first of all, I would like to thank Sam for joining us today and for always being willing to assist whenever I ask him. So, I appreciate you, Sam. And a lot of you may know Sam from working at Ivy Tech or from being on TV because he's a superstar. But Sam is the executive director of La Casa de Amistad, a Latino focused nonprofit community center on the west side of South Bend. He was born in Santa Cruz, Bolivia, and came to the States in first grade. He grew up in Michigan. He loves cars, and he's an engineer by trade, an administrator by training, and an educator by heart. He studied engineering and communications at Western Michigan University. He has a Master of Education degree in College Student Affairs Leadership from Grand Valley State University. And since joining the staff at La Casa in 2013, Sam has doubled their event fundraising income and started their first endowment with the Community Foundation. No small feat. La Casa has continued to break fundraising and programmatic records each year. And under Sam's leadership, La Casa launched its immigration legal program, its new summer preschool, city ID programs, and helped start Westside Wednesday to empower immigrant and Latino-owned businesses. Sam was appointed by the mayor of South Bend as commissioner to the Housing Authority and to the Diversity Utilization Board, helping develop minority and women-owned businesses. And he also serves on the steering committee for the West Side Main Streets project. So please help me welcome Sam.
Yay.
Yay.
I didn't hear all the applause, but you know, it's good virtually.
Sorry, we were all on mute. It was deafening.
I always feel like you need like those like laugh tracks and stuff like that. I just need to carry my own when I'm on Zoom. Well, thank you, Durana, for the invite, and thank you, Dr. Vulcan, for putting just some emphasis behind these important critical topics. And there's like 30 some people. This is great, so I appreciate this. So I wanted to start doing just a little bit of base stuff. I wanted to just give a kind of high level overview about La Casa de Amistad and kind of who we are. And then I'll give a little more about my background because it informs kind of why I think certain things about this topic in my background. And then we'll get into chatting about our topic for the day. But La Casa de Amistad was actually founded here in this community in 1973. And so if you think about, immigrant Latino serving centers in the Midwest, I always joke with people and say, we're like the great-great-grandma. There's nobody older than us. And because of that, we do a little bit of everything. So we, from a bilingual preschool to youth programming, to adult classes, to a legal clinic, to a food pantry, to utility assistance, we do everything. And our kind of like claim to fame in the region is that there isn't a center as comprehensive as ours in the entire state of Indiana. And there isn't a center comprehensive like ours in the city of Chicago. And of course, Chicago would have all the services we have, but they have a legal center and they have, after school youth programs for kids, but not one place that does all that. And it's kind of a product of South Bend's weird size, that we're big enough to have all those needs, but small enough, that we were able to build a center and that we're currently building a bigger center to be able to meet all those community needs under one space. So, and then I also just give a brief, as I talk about the history of La Casa, people ask like, were there, immigrants and Latino immigrants in this area in the early 1970s? And there was. And so there were Latino families in this area as far back as, we've seen back into the 40s and 50s and probably farther back. So it isn't that, we're a completely new community to this area. And that there was Spanish influence in Indiana. I mean, if you've done that drive, especially before they had that new little bypass, but if you've done the drive to Indianapolis, you drive through a bunch of Spanish speaking or Spanish named towns, right? La Paz, there's actually a Mexico, Indiana, right? And so there was Spanish influence in terms of the Spaniard Spanish, right? Influence in Indiana that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. So that's one that I like to just kind of talk about the community. And originally La Casa was founded to work with the youth of migrant farming families. So, and we were founded kind of as like a summer house that worked with youth who were the children of migrant farmers who were just here passing through for the summers for work. And then slowly as the community really grew and evolved and grew roots in the area, which was primarily in the late 70s, early 80s, that the community really started growing. And today, in the city of South Bend, the Latino community makes up almost 20% of the city population. It's even higher percentages in places like Elkhart and Goshen that I know this Ivy Tech region serves. And so whereas South Bend has the largest population, Elkhart and Goshen are actually larger by percentage. The city of Goshen's like 30% identified as Latino Hispanic. And so that's a little bit about kind of La Casa and a little bit about the area. And I also am I'm going to keep most of my stuff kind of short today, so I want to answer a lot of questions. And so I'll give a quick overview of who I am. I was, as Durana gave my quick overview, but I was born in Santa Cruz, Bolivia, to an American mother and a Bolivian father. My family moved to the States when I was 7. And so without getting into other related topics, it's why I do a lot of talk about dreamers and DACA. Because I came to this country by no fault of my own as well as a 7-year-old child immigrant. I just was lucky to be able to have the documentation to be a U.S. citizen, and others didn't. So I have the experience of being an immigrant. I grew up in a town called Saginaw, Michigan, where I grew up to be an engineer, and then ultimately landed working in higher education, which is what brought me to South Bend. I've been here for 12 years as a Hoosier, and came here to work at IUSB, spent years there, worked a little bit of time at Ivy Tech as well, and have now been at La Casa for 7 years. So I'll use some examples as I talk a little bit about my higher ed time. I know there's a lot of staff that are on this, so I'll kind of talk about my higher ed time, as well as we talk about kind of the evolution of terms, which is what we're here to talk about today, and how much that's evolved just in my short 42 years on this earth. And I share that because 1, yesterday was my birthday, but 2, I'll call people older than me, like 40 and older, and people younger than me, 40 and under. I generally stay away from terms like millennials or Gen Ys or boomers or whatever. So I'll kind of talk about that. And my generation is kind of that split. It tends to be people younger than me are using more modern terms, and people older than me are using other terms. And we'll get into talking a little bit about that. But I also like to be clear, I'm going to share obviously my experience. Like any cultural group, we're not monolithic. So, the Latinx community comes in a million different shades from a lot of different countries, from all parts of the world. And so that also informs our experience, and also have come to this country, or AKA been in this country for such a long time, or different amounts of time. And so their perspective of being either a U.S. citizen or not is also an interesting thing. But I'm also not a researcher, so I don't have a PhD in any of this. I'm not a sociologist. I just have a lot of lived experience and done this work. But there's also other great local folks, like Daryl Heller and Eric Love, and folks that could 2.0 some of the things that I'll kind of share with all of you today. So with that, I was asked years ago, so I'll start talking about, I'm going to back up and rewind and talk a little bit about Latino Hispanic first, and then we'll talk about Latinx. And so I was asked to teach, it's probably been about 8 years ago. I taught Latino Studies 101, literally you always joke about calling things like, that's 101. I'm like, I literally taught Latino Studies 101. That's what it was. The course was listed at IUPUI. And I taught that online for them. And their textbook was a great book I actually recommend. It's called Latinos in the New Millennium, written by Dr. Luis Fraga, Fraga. He actually now works at Notre Dame. He was not at Notre Dame when I was using his book as a text. And then when he came back to Notre Dame, I was like, oh my God, I like to chat with the guy that wrote the book I taught from. And it's actually one of the very beginning parts of the book where it was actually the assignment I would first give my students about what's the right term. Latino or Hispanic. And there's actually a lot of varying kind of opinions on that. But historically, the kind of community view of it is that the word Hispanic was something that was created and given to the community. Like we were labeled that, like you will be Hispanic. And back then we were like, okay. And we were Hispanic. That's how it was on the census. That's how it was on government forms. And that's how it was for 40, 50 years. And if you look at most historical organizations, and slowly some are changing their names, but the United States Hispanic, Leadership Institute in Chicago, one of the big kind of flagship institutions for political engagement for the community, uses the name Hispanic in their name, versus LULAC, which is the League of United Latin American Citizens, has has always used the term Latin American citizens, but also seen as an organization that's much more conservative than USHLI or USHLI out of Chicago, that uses the term Hispanic. So I can use them into kind of a juxtaposition, the two uses of the term. And then others have started changing their name, like National Council of Raza, changed their name to Unidos US, which means United Us, but kind of putting that US in there, I think, as a way to kind of connect patriotically. But so you'll see that historically, things you'll see, so things you'll read or whatever. And that was interesting when I got hired. And so I'll use that term in terms of that term kind of phasing out, and I'll draw some references in a second. But when I started working in higher ed was in 2002. And so when I started in higher ed, that's when we were actually going through all of our like materials. And I worked in student life then. And we were going through all our materials and removing the term Hispanic. And we were replacing it with what we did back then was we wrote Latino, Latina. And so that's where I'll start kind of talking about where Latinx came from, but also talking about the actual kind of, I don't say definition of, but thought process around the term Latino and Latina. But we would write it. And if you ever look at old stuff, and Ivy Tech might still have it in some of theirs. I think IU still does. But Latino is male. That is saying male person of kind of Latin descent. It became kind of just a universal term. I even use it that way. I say I'm a person in my 40s, right? So I'm that middle range. We kind of use Latino as okay. But really, when you would write it out, you should say Latino, Latina. And what we did was, instead of writing Latino, Latina, and Latina means female, we would write Latino/A, which was like Latino, Latina, instead of having to write it all out twice. And that was where kind of the origins of the word were really originally. Whereas a lot of people have thought it was about being gender neutral, which it technically is, but the X didn't stand for gender neutral. It was the O/A, and it kind of morphed into that as part of that. So it isn't part of a grander non-gendered term, but that's the point of it, is to say that Latinx means the community, not just male, female. And so what I've always, and so I'll let me rewind and kind of talk about go back to Hispanic, Latino again, and then we'll jump into kind of that transition into Latinx. And Durana, feel free to either give me like thumbs up or thumbs down, or like, oh, don't say that. And I will try to adjust accordingly. But and so going back to kind of the use of terms, once again, it's just kind of this historical change of the community. And you'll see it that I always tell people that Hispanic, most people will not find it offensive, but some people will. And so it is where like the term Hispanic has slowly gone away. But I not that we're the purveyors of all truth, but La Casa de Amistad's mission statement actually says to empower the Hispanic/Latino community within Michiana, blah, 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 blah. So we still have it in ours. We haven't reviewed it for 5 years. We reviewed it 5 years ago and we thought, well, let's leave it. And I would say that I draw this reference of the term Hispanic. It's kind of like using the word Negro. So not necessarily offensive, but if you say it just the right way, the hair on the back of your neck stands up, right? But I grew up with the United Negro College Scholarship Fund and seeing that advertised on TV, and so that you're thinking about it like that's a term my grandpa might have used, and it's dated and we need to update it, but it's not necessarily bad. But if somebody says I don't like that term, you should respect that. And I wanted to use that as an example when I talk about calling people what they want to be called. I'll kind of end on that as well, but I wanted to kind of weave that in. As I look down, I'm looking at my notes here. And I wanted to weave that in because once again, going back to not being a monolithic culture, and I'll use this example about immigration. And so there are folks that would consider themselves to have Mexican heritage, for example, from parts of Texas or California, that have actually, they've been US citizens longer than most other people. But that used to be Mexico, right? So like Texas used to be Mexico, so did California, right? And so I think people forget some of those history pieces, like when people use that term, like, I didn't cross the border crossed me. And if you've never heard that, that's like a famous line. A lot of Latinos will use that. But it is that, some large parts of the United States were Spanish and or Mexican territory. that became part of the US. And so when those people are called immigrants, or like your grandpa's an immigrant, right? It's like, not really. He actually fought in wars as a US soldier. And so those things are what's kind of interesting from that perspective. So people might also not want to be called immigrants. And we look at that from La Casa. We still have immigrant also in our mission statement. And we're also clear that not all people of Latin descent are immigrants or consider themselves immigrants. Some are, and some aren't. Some people prefer to be called, we meet a lot of people that I prefer to be called Mexican American, you know? And so that's also where I go back to call people what they want to be called. But, you know, be aware that the term is dated and has kind of moved its way out, and it is better to not use it. Especially the term Hispanic. So, and the term Hispanic then was also turned into other slurs that I won't repeat, which is, I think, also kind of why, you know, when people think of, you know, other terms, you know, that have historically been used for African Americans too, it's like, you know, like, let's move on from things because it reminds us of other things. And that's kind of how we feel about Hispanic. So Latino as a term kind of came up because of you know, the term Latin American, people from kind of more of a geography area, but also thinking about language. And that's where I won't get into the whole research side of that. But then, you know, does that include Brazil and other countries that are south of us that don't speak Spanish, but do for the most part speak Latin dialects, which would be French or Portuguese. And it's the same thing then when you look at some of the Caribbean islands that, you know, folks would not consider themselves to be Latino as well, right? So it's not just anything south of the United States, the continental United States, right? And so it is like, it's a kind of I'm sure you can Webster's look up what they say Latino is, but everybody has that kind of differentiation a little bit different, and our cultures are that different. And I like to use a couple examples about why the culture is so different. If you think about United States, I use the United States English as an example, right? How much different types of English is there, right? There's British English, which is different. There's Australian English, different. There's Kentucky English, different. California, especially if you're from Orange County, right? It's different English. And so think about Latin American countries. There's more countries, more borders, more mountains, more water that separates us. There's extreme dialects. And so where I'm from in Bolivia, I grew up on the eastern part of Bolivia. We're closest to Argentina. And so where I'm from, we speak more like Argentinians speak Spanish. And Argentinians speak what most people consider to be like an Italian dialect. If you watch any professional soccer, all the famous Argentinian soccer players have Italian last names. And most people in Argentina, a lot of people in Argentina have Spanish or Italian sounding last names, because it was a place where Italians went. It was a big Italian colony. And so they speak Spanish that way. So it's just dialectically different. And so it's something that I use that as a reference about how our community is so different than others, and why it's then offensive too. Like, I grew up, you know, as a Bolivian growing up in Michigan. I always joke with people, I'm like, as a Bolivian growing up in Michigan, and then I was Mexican. Because people, as soon as I tell them, oh, I'm Latino, they're like, oh, you don't look Mexican. And I'm like, well, one, Mexicans don't have a monolithic look, and two, I'm not Mexican, and so I got to explain all these different things, right? So, and that's when then I side with people who like to be called from where they're from. But I'm a weird mix, you know, and so I'm not the perfect example. But you can also see, like, I always like to use kind of in our kind of age range here, using personalities we would all recognize. You know, I mean, Latinos come in all shades, right? So there's Ricky Martin, but there's also Big Papi, right? And so both grew up speaking Spanish on islands right next door to each other. And if you saw them in a lineup, you might guess different things about where they were from. And then that goes to my other point, is about, I think a large part about thinking about terms or what we call people is about assumptions we make based right away on what we see, and based right away on what we hear, right? And so people tend, and that's where, you know, I use myself as an example, and I try to use myself as an example because it's easier, you know, but a lot of people see me right away and think white. They think kid that just grew up in Saginaw, Michigan. And then they hear me talk and they would think kid that grew up in Saginaw, Michigan. And then when you tell them my experience, they'd be like, oh, no way. right? And so everybody has that, kind of those assumptions we make right away, and that's part of why I think it's important that we educate ourselves to learn about these things, to understand, and to kind of draw, to learn that your brain will draw conclusions for you if you don't outthink it, right? And so you got to learn to outthink, like let me ask Sam where he's from, or his background, or why he works at La Casa. Because I get that asked a lot. Well, why is a white guy working at La Casa? I was like, well, one of the most famous executive directors we had was a white guy, but I am actually Latino, but it doesn't matter, right? And so it is important. So that's part of, I got my assumptions piece, since I've covered that. So now we're going to transition a little bit to talking about the evolution to the term Latinx, and there's even been pushback on that, right? So you can even kind of look at that, okay, good. So Violet, I like the Violet's chat there. So for people who didn't know who Big Papi, I guess because he's retired now, right? So I guess you don't see him play anymore, but I do love the Saturday Night Live sketches they do about him, which are really fun. But now I got distracted. We were talking about, transitioning to Latinx. And so there's even actually been now some pushback. I think it's the hard part with, which is good, I think, in the world we live in, that people can express their views and beliefs. But I think every term always swings one way and then kind of swings back, and then we kind of wiggle into the middle. But there's been pushback on Latinx because it erases the language part of saying Latino, Latina. And so, that Latinx isn't a real term, or, I joke, that in terms of conjugating grammar, how do you conjugate Latinx? Because it's not actually a word, where I can conjugate, other words and put them into sentences. So my grammar is always terrible, so I've never worried about how I conjugate terms in Spanish or English. So that's part of it. But I think when I talk about it, I use a couple examples about why I think it's good to use. Like whenever I speak about myself, I generally use the term I'm Latino, right? I'm an identified Latino male, and I love that, like, people put things like, and I love when people have like their pronouns in their signature. I haven't updated my signature in like 40 years, so I need to get around to doing that. But I think that also is where it identifies where people can say those things. So part of what, when people could get offended is if they don't like using gendered terms and you call them Latino or Latina, and they might not identify as either, and they might identify as Latinx, or when you're talking to a big group, it's easier to say the Latinx community, because then I am saying the Latino, Latina community, as a term that's more inclusive to everybody, which is the same. Like I like to draw references, and I also like to kind of give people excuses, to be clumsy and learn. We're all trying to be better one step at a time. But it's kind of like the term we've always used for so many years when we say you guys. And when I walk into a room of my team members and I say, hey, you guys, we need to solve this problem, right? I say that clumsily because that's how I was raised to say that. I'm not in meaning to exclude the women on my team. I'm not just saying, hey, I just want the males in this room to answer this question for me, and women here take notes. Right. I'm just saying a term, like walking in and saying, hey, you guys. And I'm personally trying to be better about that. Right. And so it's part of even saying it here and giving that suggestion to others. When you're saying Latinos, you're kind of saying the same thing. Right. You're saying for Latino males, we need more Latinos in leadership. It's like, well, you don't want women in leadership? Yeah, we do want women too. I just didn't say I also want Latinos and Latinas. And that's where, especially in spaces like that, saying Latinx is great, because I'm talking about people with that, and also people that identify, right, as Latinx, because there's people who are half Latino, Latina that don't identify. They identify as just white, right? Or they don't identify as immigrants or something else. And so this is saying, when I'm talking to the Latinx community, I'm talking about people who identify as Latino, Latina, and want to be named in that group, is an important part of that. So with that, then I kind of transitioning to my last piece. I want to make sure I left lots of time just to have some conversation, whether that's on immigration or the local community. But the last one too is when I think about, even just the term immigrant. And so what's layered on top of all of these pieces is, that, and I mentioned it earlier, that not all people that would identify as Latinx in some capacity are immigrants or consider themselves to be immigrants. And so I think that's also where we as an organization too get chopped up in that, where it's in our mission statement, the Hispanic Latino community and empower immigrants is part of our what we say. And so, but we're not just focused on helping people who are immigrants, and immigrants really are defined as people who are born in another country and came here. And so, you know, it is where you layer all those factors on. It is what makes people, we're all complicated individuals. And I think at the end of the day, everybody just wants to be loved and appreciated. And we all just want to be called what we're called. And I think especially people who have names that are hard to pronounce, we know the difference when your name's pronounced right intentionally. We know the difference when your name is pronounced wrong intentionally, and when your name's pronounced wrong accidentally. And so I think it's the same when I think about terms. When somebody would call me a term that I don't like, if I correct them and then they do it again, then I know they're doing it on purpose. But if somebody clumsily said, "Oh, you're Hispanic," right? I would not be offended at all, right? But if then I said, "Well, you know, I prefer to be called Latino," or "You know, I'm Bolivian," and then later they're like, "You're Hispanic," right? Then I'm like, "Okay, now you're out of line." And so I think that's where, you know, I think the other thing to just give advice to everybody, and I give this advice to advocates, you know, is to allow people to be clumsy as well. You know, allow people to everyone's trying to figure it out, and to give people some grace. You know, if they use a term that you either personally don't like, or that you think other people personally don't like, in general, we can all, and I always tell people, I can only speak for myself. And I say that in public speaking, I prefer to use the term Latinx when referring to myself. I prefer, I'm Latino, I identify that way, as a Spanish speaker. But, you know, it's about calling people what they want to be called and being respectful, and then using terms that are the most inclusive possible of everybody, or just inclusive of everybody. And keeping them broad is what's good. Like, we want a bigger umbrella to welcome more people in, so that more people, and that's where I wanted to close. I was like, Joanna, what was at the end of your title? It was,
what's the buzz about Latinx?
No, your professional title.
Oh, diversity, equity, and belonging.
Belonging, that's it. And so that's where I wanted to end with, like, and then transition to back to you, Joanna, and then to questions. You know, I think everybody wants to belong somewhere. And that's a key part. And the piece that I'll share about, especially immigrant communities, is that immigrants, by and large, and I'll share my personal experience with it, by and large, generally feel like we don't belong anywhere. And what's really tough, especially for immigrants that would especially fit the physical mold of being an immigrant in terms of looking more like one, we're in a country where we're often told we're not welcome. Right? So it's not even that we're made to feel not welcome. We're actually told we're not welcome sometimes. And so it really matters to us when somebody tells us we're welcome and we belong. Because what's also tricky for folks that have been here a long time, when I go back to Bolivia, it's been 4 years now, or 3 years now, since I've been back, you know, I'm not Bolivian anymore. You know, even though I have it on my Facebook profile about where I'm from, right? I go to Bolivia and I look like an American. And I remember, I always tell the story that when I was 16 years old, I went to Bolivia and I was so excited to be back home, you know, in the country. And I realized, like everybody knows I'm American, right? I'm getting charged American prices. And I asked my cousin, and I go, and in Santa Cruz, where I'm from, was actually a German settlement. So there's a lot of blonde hair, blue eyed people in the city that I grew up in. My dad's short, dark, indigenous looking, but I look like the people from my town. And so I asked him, how do people know I'm like an American? And he goes, it's your shoes. And I was like, what? He's like, Americans wear like the most obnoxious sneakers. And I had like these Air Max whatevers, right? I was 16. And I was like, you know, but it ties back to, though, for immigrants, often we don't feel home if we go home. And the place that we call home, because most immigrants call this home, because it is home, they're often told they're not welcome. So I love this belonging piece, and I think encouraging that and finding ways to tell people they're welcome under the Ivy Tech umbrella will go a long way. And I think even just having these conversations, it's why I don't think I've ever turned Dorana down for a favor. So, and as I'll kind of close, just as thank you for inviting me. But I always loved my time, and still love my time engaging with Ivy Tech students in the community, as students, as alums, as students that are thinking about going into fields that would connect them through Ivy Tech. And I appreciate all of your time listening to me today. And I'm ready to take some questions, and I can read through the chat or however you want to moderate this, Durana.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that. But I want to say a couple of things. One, someone posted that this was very good information. They would not have known that using the word Hispanic is frowned upon had it not been for this meeting. So I think that's a great piece to even talk about that. Also, so I have a question, since you did say that. What about the fact that September 15th through October 15th is Hispanic Heritage Month? So how is that perceived, and should it be something different? Because I mean, we're talking about, even on the our statewide diversity committee is talking about what are we doing for Hispanic Heritage Month. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm gonna hit one up that's in the chat here that I actually really, really like. And it is about calling people what they want to be called. I love that. So I think, somebody said in there, a lot of folks have names that are hard to pronounce in English, and they either like having an American surname, and I actually use this because I kind of do the same. So my legal name is Samuel, but it's spelled the exact same as Samuel. You call me Samuel twice, like I might take you outside, right? And just like the hair on my neck stands up, because I'm not Samuel, but it's written the same. And so it's always why I've gone by Sam, because I just don't write Samuel anywhere, because I'll be called Samuel all the time. And so, that's kind of why I go by the name Sam. Both my older brother's name is Miguel, which is Michael in Spanish. And so he writes it his way. And my younger brother, he grew up as an Andy, but his first name is Andres. And he transitioned in college to saying, I want to be called Andres. I still call him Andy because he's my little brother. I just can't help it. But when I go visit him out in Boston, he is known to everybody in his community as Andres. And I think that's really cool. And so it is. And some students will like it. They're like, I want to be called John, or I want to be called Felix instead of Fidencio. And so it is asking people what they want to be called and calling that, even down to their names, of course, whether that's culturally or not. So my joke, Durana, I don't know if I ever kind of joked with you about this when I worked at Ivy Tech, but, we would always complain, that we'd always go back and forth. And there's always this cultural competition, right, between the Latinx community and African Americans. And, there's always the complaint that Black History Month's the shortest month of the year. And I get that. But we're like, but we only get 2 half months. We didn't even get a whole month. We got half of September and half of October. It's terrible. And I will share why that's the case. So there used to be a National Hispanic Heritage Week, which was around September 15th. It was always whatever week had September 15th in it, was National Week. And that's because I think it's like 10 or 11 Latin American countries have their Independence Days around September 15th. So like September 15, 16, and then like I think September, there's a 19 and a 20 and a 21 in there as well. But that's when the sweeping loss of the Spanish armies were, and a lot of countries were liberated. And so that's why that it was kind of put as 2 half months. I think the one thing that's important for institutions to do, and I remember seeing this as when I was a student, we used to complain a lot, is having some parity in what's being spent and what's being done. So saying, like, I remember it was when I was a senior in college, my institution brought in Chuck D for Black History Month. And I was like, that was so cool. And then like for Hispanic Heritage Month, we get like this cheesy mariachi band in the union, for lunch. And they didn't even play for an hour. It was like 30 minutes. And so we'd be like, that's not fair to us, right? It's not. And so it was things like that to think about, like, what are you doing that's fair across the board, right? And there's Asian History Month, there's, women's history, there's a lot of different things. So I also think now that there's been so many things, it's a way, like, how do you just celebrate inclusion year round on like a regular thing, and just be consistent? Because you also shouldn't just wait to celebrate your African American students till February, right? You can't be like, hey, I know I want to celebrate you, but I got to wait 2 more weeks, right? So we should just do those things all year round, which is why I actually kind of hate those kind of months and things like that, because it feels like, you can celebrate my culture in January if you want, and do stuff then. So that's one. The other one is, I think, I'm a little more kind of conservative when I think about programming. I love programs with food. I think it's just me. I do think it's just clear not to define cultures by how they eat though. But food is just such an awesome way for people to engage and connect. And so, you know, when you break bread with people, it's just different. It's different. You have that opportunity. And so I do think it's a double-edged sword. So I always share that to just be very careful. And I've seen at some institutions, you know, just programs for cultural celebrations that I'm like, this is terrible. You might as well have just gone to Hacienda for lunch and called it a day. And so I do think it is, you want to, and I think that's why I love like doing this, you know, and other things that are similar to have good conversations. And for me, I always just tell people, just stop waiting to celebrate people for a month, you know, celebrate everybody year round and be open and inclusive.
So is
Can
the
Go ahead,
term-
Doran. I wanted to interject, but I'll wait for you.
Okay, I just have a question. I was really wanting to know about, is there a negative feeling about the fact that it is called Hispanic Heritage, since you said, you know, no?
Once again, you know, it was, I forget which president did it, but I want to say it was Ford did the week, and then Reagan made it a month, if I remember correctly. So yeah, I don't think so. I've never heard anybody, you know, like I've not seen the moveon.org petition to change the name. So I think it's fine calling it that.
That's where I want to interject, actually. I'm a tad bit older than Sam. So, and I don't know if you mentioned it because I just came a little bit late. The definition of Hispanic means Spanish speaking, Hispanoparlantes. And that includes everybody from Latin America, that's where the Latino part is, and Spain. Once you use the word Latino, it takes away from, I mean, the Spaniards are not included. And again, I'm a little bit older than you, Sam. So the way I'm, for those of you who do not know me, I'm from Puerto Rico. So what I was taught and what I learned is, yo soy Hispano, I'm Hispanic, because I am Spanish. I took offense to the word Hispanic. On the contrary, that, in my opinion, was a little more inclusive. Now, while Sam was talking, I was Googling where it became offensive. And I was, again, Google was telling me and all the information, I was just looking. It actually depends on the area of the United States. Some people prefer the word Latino or Latina or Latinx now, or Hispanic or Hispano or Hispana. And I don't think, like I agree with you, Sam, I don't think it is offensive, and I don't think it needs to be changed. I also agree with you. We just have to listen to what they would like to be known for, because I am not Mexican and neither is Sam. Sam's background is from Bolivia. And all of these cultures of all of these countries are so different and so rich. So it's just ask, hey, where is your family from? And I mean, I do that all the time because I want to learn. And just because I speak Spanish, I don't know how to make guacamole. I do, but that's not in my background. It's just a matter of include. And I like your idea of food, because all of our countries have different specialties and stuff, and it is not hacienda. So I mean, that would be much more inclusive. So I think I mean, that is what it's known as, Hispanic Heritage Month, and just include all of these countries and their culture and how rich they are.
Yeah, and that's a good point too about regional vernacular. So like in Texas, the term Hispanic would be much more readily used in a state like Texas. I don't really know why, but you'll see it and you'll hear it, and people will more self-identify with it. But
Right.
in California, not so much. And interestingly, in California, you'll hear a lot more the term. You don't hear it much out here, but you'll hear the term Chicano, which was kind of an older term that really surfaced as an anti-Hispanic term. Like, we're going to call ourselves Chicano. And I just think it didn't take off. And then Latino kind of took off as the next term. But Chicano, especially for folks from California, was a very kind of term to identify and to also kind of remove the Spanish Latin influence, because Chicano was more about the indigenous cultures of specifically Central America, and thinking about like the Olmecs, Aztecs, and being much more indigenous, as especially a lot of the community, most of California was very much more. And if you look at people too, was much more indigenous looking people. Whereas, like, for example, my father is very indigenous Incan looking, not very Spanish. And it was interesting. My daughter and I just did, for Father's Day, she bought me that ancestry.com thing, and I did that. And I'm like, I think it was close to like 30-some% indigenous South American. I don't have Spanish blood. I have a lot of English blood from my mother. But it is, where you see that a lot of the cultures were very indigenous. And so, and that depends on what parts of Mexico they might be from, like folks from Monterrey, which was very Spanish influenced. You'll see a lot of folks from that area, or from the DF, from Mexico City, the capital, that are blonde hair, blue-eyed, and their families have been in Mexico for 200 years.
Right, and I mean, same in Latin America and Argentina. Like Sam said, there's a lot of Germans. Actually, my family immigrated to Argentina after during World War II. But I mean, in Puerto Rico, where I'm from, it is a combination of the Spaniards and a combination of the indigenous, the Taínos, and then the African slaves that were brought in by the Spaniards. So it is a whole melting pot, and that's what makes it Puerto Rican. So again, it's back to what that ancestry is, if you will, and I mean, but all of us are considered Hispanos or Latinos.
So Sam, I don't know if you're looking at the questions.
Yep.
We have a few here, just a couple. One thing though that, Chancellor, did you want to talk about the experience that you had at that meeting when you used the term Latinx? You're on mute, Chancellor.
All right, yeah. So, yeah, interestingly, I was talking about some of the things that Durana is implementing, and the fact that Sam was going to be speaking, and I actually referenced the title of this and mentioned Latinx, and one of my peer chancellors, who comes from Spain originally, I guess, really took offense at that use of Latinx, and she said, I'd prefer Hispanic or Latino, and it really kind of set me back on my heels, because again, I thought Latinx was as generic as you could get, and it was more inclusive because it could be lifestyle, it could be a lot of different things, right? But for whatever reason, I mean, she really took sharp offense to it, and I apologized and said, well, hey, I don't know anything. Just tell me what you want me to refer to, various populations as. And, again, it was completely out of ignorance, and I apologize. Because again, I think most people seriously are not interested in offending or, hurting anybody's feelings. I can genuinely speak, when I say something and it hurts somebody's feelings, it's completely out of ignorance. I can assure you of that. My intentions are never to disparage anyone or anybody's, race or background. And to that end, I was really kind of surprised, and it's part of the reason why, I even emailed Sam prior to this session just to make sure that we touched on it, because again, no one wants to be in that position, but the point that we shouldn't be shy about saying, look, how would you best like to be referred to as, should I be in that position or have that opportunity to refer to your background? And again, very reasonable, and it's not offensive to ask somebody that. So, it seems like common sense once somebody tells you, oh yeah, why don't you do that? So yeah. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and I think it is, once again, Latinx is the most inclusive term. There's few people that would be offended by it. And generally, I always find the ones that are offended by it tend to be the most educated, and then folks who are attacking it from a linguistic position, because it's a made up word, right? So, and I think we'll see how history judges the term, kind of like I used the example of Chicano earlier, like a group of folks wanted to be called Chicanos and pushed for it. And it gained some traction, but it never really took off. And so I also think people, like I mentioned, need to give each other some grace. I always tell people, I generally don't mean to offend you. but sometimes I mean to insult you, and you'll know when it's happening. You know, and so and most times when you're coming up with, you know, how you decide to label somebody off of an initial reaction or to say something, you know, if everybody allowed themselves and others some grace to try to figure that out and give everybody an opportunity to find their way, I think is good. And I wanted to jump on a couple. So the other question in the chat here, and then a couple that are also there were sent directly to me. One of them, I think, for institutions that are trying to be more inclusive, or maybe feel more welcoming, is finding ways to say it and to say it early. And I'll use the example like with Hispanic Heritage Month being in September, right? That's great because you can start off the year celebrating those students, right? But then that's terrible for your African American students, right? Because you're not celebrating them till next year or next semester. And so I think with any of the communities, especially students who are marginalized or especially more prone to either whether thinking about, you know, stopping out, or if they even feel like they're in the right place, or, you know, we use the new term imposter syndrome. And so, you know, for students that you are worried about welcoming, just flying that flag high and early to let them know. And it doesn't have to be big events, but, you know, how do you send that message? And I think some of that can be done with the way you talk about things, the way you say things, the types of activities that are offered or events that are done. And I'll use that example, even just talking about taking race and culture out of it as an easy example. Oftentimes non-traditional students feel not welcomed and feel like they're not ready for school again. And so, and oftentimes a lot of, and I came at this from, you know, having been a student activities administrator, you know, both here at Ivy Tech and at IUSB, you know, was like, well, if I'm doing all my events for students at, you know, 8 o'clock at night, because that's when we do student life events, I'm not being inclusive of my student population, and a group of students that generally feel unwelcomed, I unwelcomed. By saying we're doing an event to welcome students at 8 o'clock at night when it's your kid's bedtime and you got to be home. And so we really try to take a step back at our programming and think about, how does our programming be inclusive of a parent? How is our programming inclusive of a first generation African-American student? You know, how's our program inclusive of Latina immigrant student just starting a program? You know, and so it's just thinking about like what would interest them to come, what would make them want to come, and finding ways that it includes everybody, and doing that early. And I remember the research was, some of the research around student activities, engagement around campuses, while mostly focused on a lot of four-year institutions, I always thought translated well to commuter institutions and community colleges. But it's called First 10 Days. And there's actually was a book written years ago called First 10 Days. I want to say the late Chickering was involved in that, but and so it talks about how like what students do over their first 10 days on campus really drives what they're going to do the rest of the time. That's why fraternities like to recruit right away at the beginning to kind of get them involved and engaged, because once they get set into their rut of what they do, that's what they're going to do for the next 2 years, 4 years, whatever. And so really hitting hard on those first 10 days to welcome them to do stuff, and to rope them into campus. Because as anybody who does student retention work, you know, if you wait to help a student who's about to drop out, you know, on October 31st to save him or her before the December finals, right, it's done, right? It's done. You're throwing money in the wind right there. And so you got to get them on, you know, September 4th, and get a conversation with them about how they're welcome and welcome to your campus. Other ones here I saw in the chat, one of them, somebody asked a question about kind of like the connections, you know, between the Latino and African-American community. I would say locally here, the connection's better than some places. In other places, it's interestingly not great in terms of cultural competition. And I had that in my undergraduate institution. We always competed over like what the African-American students got versus what the Latino student union got. And, you know, we competed with each other, and we were wrong. And I think sometimes the institution set us up to fight with each other. And so I think however the institution can set the groups up to work together is key. And it is where our communities do have so much overlap and so much connectivity from the Afro-Caribbean influences, you know, through, somebody mentioned being Puerto Rican, Puerto Ricans come in every single shade imaginable, and also speak an interesting dialect of Spanish. And so, we all kind of do. And so that's where, we are interesting communities. My best friend in college, Victor Rivera, was Puerto Rican from Santurce. But on the shade of darkness was about as far away from my skin color as it gets. And so, but we both identified as Latino, and looked very, very different and from different places and spoke different Spanish. And so it's an interesting kind of connection between the communities, but it is that part of it, language brings us together. And then other folks thinking about food, I'd get asked that all the time, like, how do Bolivians eat their tacos? I was like, I don't know, at a Mexican restaurant like Americans do, because we don't eat tacos. It's just not a thing in Bolivia. And so I think it is things like that are fun, that you get to educate people. And you can also, I tend to kind of joke about stuff, but you can also be lighthearted about it. Or I could have been pissed off, like, why do you think Bolivians eat tacos? I was like, well, because it's all they see on TV, right? So once again, giving people some grace is, I think, very important. I'm looking at some other questions here. Well, thanks, Brianna, for liking my word grace.
Grace, yeah. A lot of them are statements, no, not really questions. Did you say you got some questions personally?
Yeah, I covered one of them already. The other one that I will share, what's been tricky too, I think, with everything, especially I think why Latinos get so sensitive about stuff right now, is because our culture and our immigration status has been so highly politicized, that I think we also are kind of just sprung right now, like ready to be like, what'd you say? And so that is part of the challenge, I think, right now, especially. I think it's why it's more important than ever, but it is part of the challenge. Like, sometimes I see things from institutions, and I sometimes my general just inclination is like, they're trying to rope us in, and so it doesn't feel authentic. And so I think that takes time. And I think consistency is important there, right? A school, you can't just say, hey, we're welcoming you and we're going to celebrate you, and just assume everybody's going to go, oh, okay, good. Right? You got to show them, and it takes time, and you got to build trust. And so I think those things, people who constantly want quick results on how to connect with our community, it's not going to work. And I'll use the example for myself. I'm a Latino immigrant. I'm a native Spanish speaker. When I got my job at La Casa 7 years ago, in my first year and a half, I probably gained like 25 pounds. And the reason that happened was because I ate at the Mexican restaurants, practically breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day, because it was the only way I was going to get street cred. I didn't grow up in that neighborhood. I'm not from Indiana. I don't necessarily look the part. And it took time for me to be in the streets every day, talk. And I still, to this day, I tell people, if you want to know what's happening in the neighborhood, ask a waitress. Because they'll tell you what street needs. I always tell mayors, I was like, ask waitresses. They'll tell you what street needs to get fixed. They know what where problems are happening. Like, they know everything. And so that's how I connected to the community. And it took time. I couldn't just show up one day at Taqueria Chicago and be like, hey, I'm the new guy at La Casa. Tell me all your secrets and things you're worried about, so I can go address them, right? The title helped because I was at La Casa Trusted Source, but they had to see me 3, 4, 5 times before somebody there would be like, my cousin has this issue, can you help? And then they would trust me. And so those are the ways that it takes time. And so, and I've seen a lot of institutions, I've done a lot of work with places that want to connect. And after 9 months of trying, they gave up. And the community takes note, and people take note. And so I think that's part of what just takes time too for the institution. I'm also kind of rounding back on that question. The other one too, thinking politically, I think what's interesting with our culture right now, somebody asked about, people celebrating their ethnic heritage. It's different, because of, I think, how politicized, and I'll say specifically like the Mexican community is. If somebody was celebrating Polish heritage, right, or being Italian, obviously this town celebrates being Irish, and like, I don't know a lot of Irish people around here. But if you celebrate being Mexican, it's political, right? And I'm like, why is it okay to fly a flag that says Polish and proud, but if someone flew a flag that said Mexican and proud, somebody might come and rip it out of their yard and light it on fire, And so like our community has to think about that. And does think about that because it happens, or they know that it might happen. And so there is like this weird, with our community about trying to celebrate being Latino or being part of the Latinx community or being a Mexican immigrant, where they feel like they can't be as proud of it because people judge them. But other cultures get to be uberly proud of Dingus Day and pierogies and you name it from other cultures. And while we're happy that people appreciate tacos, they still feel like the community is not appreciated, and just our food is. And so it is, I think interesting to just kind of see that. And I think it's the politics of today that we've got to continue to fight through to let everybody know wherever you're from, or however you identify, you should be able to celebrate without people kind of judging you on that. Other questions? I'm kind of going through the chat here.
A lot of them are statements, not necessarily questions, but I do want to say, is there any questions? Well, it's something interesting, like Gwen wrote something and I thought it was interesting, that everyone can read, and I responded. So she was talking a little bit about how, what you talked about kind of a little bit earlier about some people like to be called, Black, or some maybe like to be called African-American, and she's from Minnesota and she was a Black kid born in Minnesota. And so she prefers to be referred to as Black. And I am somebody that grew up on the south side of Chicago. And of course, and either term is okay with me. So it's just kind of like you said, it just kind of depends on, where you are, who you are, and how you interpret things. So I think that's interesting to know. So I'm okay with Black or African American, where she prefers Black, and that's okay. But I think, like you said earlier, it's a matter of asking, or having that discussion, having that, not because I've had students that said, I'm not from Africa, call me Black, and that's fine. But it's, again, like maybe asking and having those conversations, which I think is a good thing to do, not assume.
Yeah, I use an example. One time after speaking, at an event, I often would say things like, and I try to be very careful now of saying things like, we all came to this country for opportunity, and right, for African Americans, they come to this country for opportunity. And so I think it's also where, like, oh, I wasn't obviously trying to be offensive, but I was specifically thinking about immigrants, and the same thing for immigrants. Some weren't coming here seeking for opportunity. Some people were fleeing violence. And so I think it's just always hard in general, to not generalize and to be open, and to then, take criticism and negative feedback, or however you want to call it, and say, I will be better and be more clear, the way that I say things in the future, to try to be as inclusive as possible all the time.
Okay, so wow, we're at the end of this discussion, which went really well. And I don't know if we have any last minute questions, but again, everybody was kind of speaking, just putting information in the chat. And I think that's really excellent that we did that. And also it shows that we can have this discussion and others, again. So I'm really thankful that you were able to join us, Sam. And and I'm always thankful because, like you said, you never say no. When I ask you to come talk about DACA, you're like, okay, I'm there, or whatever I ask you, you do it. So I appreciate it. So anyone, thank you all for joining us. And if you have any, thoughts or anything that you would like to send me later, please send it to me in email. If you even have ideas for a First Friday discussion, please send that as well. So thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Sam.
And any of you can email me as well if you'd like questions. But thank you, everybody. Have a good afternoon and enjoy the holiday. Hope everybody gets a chance to rest and relax and refresh. Thank you. Thank you, Dorana.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.